Our new house was over 100 years old by the time we moved in. My mom and stepfather had gotten married a few months earlier, and now with a bigger family of 13 kids, they needed more room to hold all of us. When we moved in that summer, I was just 9 years old. I shared an attic bedroom with my younger siblings on one side, and my two oldest sisters slept in the room next to ours. My parents and my brothers all had rooms down on the main level of the house. Since it was such an old house, we didn't have central air conditioning. We had to use one of those old bulky window air conditioning units. It was an old brown AC unit that came with the house and made a lot of grunting noises when we turned it on. But it kept us cool during those hot summer days. Unfortunately, there was only one window air conditioning unit in our house, and it was on the main level where the dining room, kitchen, and living rooms were. My parents could not afford to buy us our own unit to put upstairs right away, and since heat rises up to the attic, it was always sweating hot in our room, even with the fan on constantly. A few weeks went by at our new house, and we started complaining about the heat and how hot it was getting upstairs in the attic. We could no longer stand the heat, and the fans were not doing enough. My mom decided that all the kids would just all come and sleep in the living room where the air conditioning was, so that we could all keep cool. We then went and grabbed our blankets and pillows and laid them out in a line across the living room floor. To give you a vague layout of our floor plan on the lower level, in our house, the living room was connected into the dining room. Then there was a swinging door that led into the kitchen. My siblings and I were all sound asleep on the living room floor. I slept next to my sister with my back to the front door of the house, so I could see clearly into the dining room where our large dining table was. I can't remember what woke me up in the middle of the night, but while I was still laying there with my eyes closed, unable to fall back into sleep, I heard it. I heard a scraping sound. That sound that forks and spoons make when it scrapes against an empty plate. The air conditioning was making the usual grunting noise it always had. It was familiar to me, but the scraping and clinking was unusual. At first, I didn't know where it was coming from. I thought maybe someone had gotten up for a late night snack, and so I ignored it. The scraping and clinking sound continued, and it really started to irritate me. I lifted up my head to see who was making all that noise. I had not heard anyone get up, and there was no light on in the kitchen that I could see through the cracks in the door. Since the house was so old, we could usually hear when someone was walking around because the floors would creak. I looked over at the dining room table and did not see anyone sitting there either, but the scraping and clinks had stopped. I thought it was strange, but decided to try and go back to sleep. I laid back down on my pillow, and a few seconds later, I could hear the scraping of the dishes clinking again. As soon as I lifted my head and looked straight into the dining room, it would stop. I kept looking around and waited to see if the noise would come back again, but all I could hear was the sound coming from the air conditioner. I started to really get scared, and so I decided to lay back down closer to my sister. No one else had gotten up, and it was still really dark outside. I threw the blanket over my head and moved in closer to my sister. I could hear the scraping and clinking from the dishes as I laid there next to my sister. I was terrified at this point, and so I tried waking her up. but it was hard for me to try to explain it to her, since I was just a child. All I could say was that I heard noises of the dishes coming from the kitchen. We both sat there and listened, but the noises disappeared. She was so tired, and eventually told me to go back to sleep. And after just a few minutes, she was out cold. But I couldn't fall back asleep. I just kept hearing that noise. I decided to throw the blanket over my head and put both of my hands over my ears. I don't remember how long I stayed in that position because I eventually got tired and fell asleep. But to this day, I still don't know what made that scraping and clinking sound that night. But the scariest part in all this is that, since that noise kept stopping whenever I lifted up my head to see who it was, I'm sure that whoever or whatever it was saw me, but I couldn't see them. This is the part that still bothers me, and it's been over 20 years. But fast forward years later, that same sister in whom I mentioned earlier had become a shaman. She went on to explain to me that she had seen visions of an old white man who used to live in our house. He was very unhappy with us there, and so when we were all asleep, he would roam around the house as he normally would, as if he were still alive, eating his meals at the dining room table, holding his ground of where he felt he belonged. Hearing this gave me even more chills, and I'm just glad that I no longer live in that house.